Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Holly Gallagher, and I'm trying to admit at the same time here. I'll be talking to you today. I teach courses at UGA in the biology in biology on scientific research writing and science and health writing for broader populations. And today I'm going to talk to you about kind of organizing your thoughts and kind of getting together a plan to write your research paper. So a few things we'll do today. I don't know that we're going to get through all of these, but we are going to work on writing your research story summary. So coming up with a plan for your research story, creating an outline, and we'll probably get to writing your paper opening. So you're probably familiar with this figure, and this is just the hourglass visualization, which is a visualization of the structure of a scientific research paper. So we're not going to have time to go through all of the sections and talk about what they all do. But really what we're going to do is kind of work on some behind the scenes tools to make sure that all these sections are working together, to make sure that you are starting off in the direction to create a cohesive research story in your paper. So you may be at different stages of your research and writing. If you have data, it's often a good idea to start at the results section writing and really create your research story around your results. But as I said today, we're gonna kind of do some more behind the scenes planning rather than working directly on those sections. So the idea that the idea behind creating your research story is to really maintain cohesion in your paper. This helps you make decisions about what to include in your manuscript or what not to include. So that's often a difficult part of writing, is the challenge to know, what do I include? You probably have lots of data you could include. So how are you going to frame your research? Really developing your research story will prompt you to focus on how your reader is going to read your paper rather than just writing it for yourself. And then it also prompts you to really focus on the big picture concerns of your paper first, like the organization and evidence, rather than focusing on those sentence level issues that you can work out later. So a research paper, you may have heard of a research paper, like different analogies for what a research paper is. It's just to start off, it's not a diary, so it's not a record of what you've done because it's crafted for other people. It's not a recipe, even though, yes, you want your readers to be able to understand your research enough to replicate it, but it's not a recipe for them. It is you sharing your research with them in a crafted way. And it's not an encyclopedia. So what it is it's something that you design to tell your readers the things that you have decided that they need to know. So I hope I'm drawing your attention to the reader here and your part in crafting your research paper, and not doing a plug and chug where you need to fill out different sections with information in a fill in the blank kind of way. You are making the decisions about what to include. So you want to step back and think through how you're designing it and how your reader is going to respond to what your design. So if we're thinking of the reader, we need to be thinking about the story. Every paper tells a story, whether it's a good one or a bad one or a compelling one or not. but there's no story without the reader. You're always going to have a reader, and that's the important part of writing your paper. So you need to figure out what is that interesting question or concept that your story sets up and then resolves for your reader. That's what your research paper is going to do. So we're going to walk through some steps then to do that. Just to help you kind of think about how we can use the idea of a story in a research paper a little bit more. In fiction, you have a story that sets up and then resolves an interesting question in the reader's mind, right? And this happens by exposing characters to a plot. So a research paper does something similar. You have a question. What did you set out to learn? You have characters. They're your study species, field sites, reagents, apparatus, equations. You have plot. What happened? What are the experiments that were done? What were the data analyses that were done here? So to figure out what your story is for your research, we have 3 steps we can go through. First, we're gonna work on identifying a central question and its answer, kind of like a mini summary of your story. Second, we're gonna figure out which information, which data analyses and interpretation belong in the paper, and then which ones might be better reserved for a different manuscript, or they maybe might not make it into one of your papers. And third, once you have the content, then you need to decide on the order in which to present it. So kind of the plot. So the first thing is this mini summary. The mini summary is the central question and it's an answer. It's the purest distillation of your research story. A clear central question gives you your paper a single obvious direction. Every element of your paper then can work together to draw the reader into your question's answer. So whenever you're not sure whether, a data set or analysis or figure table, anything belongs in the manuscript, you can come back to this 2-sentence mini summary and you can figure out, would including this help to tell this research story I want to tell, or is it going to distract from the research story I'm telling? So it's going to be your central question and major answer. But this is not something you're going to include in your paper. This is a device for you, and you may have to revise it as you're working on your paper. But the key thing is that it's going to shape your paper. So even if you're revising it, then you need to go back and make sure your paper is still working with that mini summary that you have here. So we're going to walk through an example first. This is from Stephen Hurd's book, The Scientist's Guide to Writing. And here's a synopsis of a researcher who's already done research. So you're an astronomer and interested in the formation of massive stars. You have used the new Atacama large millimeter sub-millimeter array to image the Eagle, Orion, and Carina nebulae, where new massive stars are being formed. ALMA is more sensitive and has higher resolution than any other millimeter wave telescope. And you have reams of imagery, spectral data, and so on. But what story will you tell? So you can imagine how this is a situation that can occur in any other fields, scientific fields, especially here. So what are the important parts here that we need to include in this paper? How do we need to frame this as a story? Let's go through some possible mini summaries for this person. So the first possible mini summary is something like this. ALMA provided the most detailed images ever made of the Orion, Eagle, and Carina nebulae. I explain how ALMA works and show some of the images. So the problem with this one, though, is this mini summary, is that that it focuses on the research that was done rather than on a question that was answered. It makes no reference to star formation. And if you remember, this astronomer is interested in the formation of massive stars. So it makes no reference to star formation. It forces the reader to kind of do the job of analyzing and interpreting the data. So this is not kind of a good mini summary of a research story. Let's look at another example here. In this mini summary, we have, I present images of star-forming regions in the Orion, Eagle, and Carina nebulae taken at 8 wavelengths from 0.4 to 10 millimeters. They may show many protostars, some in groups. Again, this summary is lacking in that this time we have star formation mentioned, but we again ask no specific question about star formation. So we're not sure about the question being asked here. It gives some information on methods we can kind of gather, but we haven't mentioned ALMA, which is apparently important for this research. And we're again left with the job of figuring out how all of this comes together here, why it matters. Let's look at another one. In this mini summary, I outline what we know about star formation and stellar evolution. I present the ALMA images of massive protostars at various stages of stellar evolution. We're getting better here. The writer makes some attempt to establish the relevance of the data that was collected, but star formation and stellar evolution is still way too big for a single paper. And again, we still have no specific question presented. We can assume maybe that the reader, or that the images are going to tell the reader something about massive star formation, but it's not clear what. So here's the final mini summary we're going to look at. If massive stars form with gravitational assists from their neighbors, then massive protostars should always appear among the other protostars. However, solitary massive protostars are common in ALMA images of the Orion, Eagle, and Carina nebulae. So I'll give you a minute to think about, is there a central question suggested here? Just take a minute to see if you think there's a central question suggested in this mini summary. So yes, the central question here is, do massive protostars form via the combined gravity of neighbors? So that's the implied question. It's not stated explicitly, but it's implied. It's written into the summary. And then do we have a answer to that in this mini summary? Yeah, we have an answer, and that is no. The evidence is showing us this is not true from the data here, or the data is not kind of showing this. So I'm going to give you all a little bit of time to work on writing up a mini summary, just to get you, just to kind of give you a moment while it's fresh in your mind to apply this to your own work. Just a minute or two. You can, if you have data and you're working out a story, or even if you've been writing, just take a minute to think about what your central question might be, and what that answer would be. And this can help to frame your research story. And this is something, again, can keep coming back to, but this is really going to help you shape the rest of your paper. So the way that we'll do that, the central question drives the function of each part of your manuscript then. So in this example, the introduction then we know needs to set up the cluster gravity hypothesis and specify what's needed to test it. Now that we know the central question and answer, we know what the introduction needs to do. The methods section then needs to explain how we can measure protostar masses and distinguish between solitary protostars and sets of neighbors. So that's what the methods needs to do to work within this research story. Then we know that results will tabulate frequencies of solitary and then neighbored protostars. And I'll let me answer the question in just a minute. The discussion then will interpret the results as a test of the cluster hypothesis. So somebody's asking, if we don't have data, do we add a possible answer for now? Yeah, that's what I would do to give direction. It is challenging depending on where you are in the research process. But the thing is you want to be writing throughout, and you're going to have to keep coming back and revising. If you have data, obviously, you can start with a results section and figure out your question and answer. But as you're working through, as you're doing research, you're still going to be accumulating a lot, and you can be working on refining that, or working on developing a question and then refining it as you do the research. Let me see here. Okay, we actually did that. Next thing we're going to do is you need to figure out what information, data analysis, and interpretation belong in the paper and which are better reserved for another paper. So we can do this by going through a kind of story summary. And these are 9 questions that will use that mini summary that you have, the central question and answer, and then build from it. So I'll give you a few minutes to take a look at these, and you can start jotting things down if you have data. If you don't have data, you'll know you have, this will give you a sense of direction for what you will be doing with your data. Having this direction is also helpful if you are just also figuring out what you need to include in your introduction. Even if you haven't completed your research, you'll need to figure out what you're going to include in your introduction and how you're going to frame how you're going to set up that research conversation that you're going to join. So you need to frame your research within a larger research conversation that you're going to set up in your introduction. So this process can help you figure out how you're going to frame your research within a larger research conversation. And this video is being recorded and it will be available. All right, so let's move on for now. Hopefully you've noticed that these questions really work through the IMRAD structure, the structure of a scientific research paper. What is the central question? Why is the question important? What are the data needed to answer the question? Methods, then we get into the data obtained, the results. And then we get into, how the results answer the central question and what does this answer tell us about the broader field? That sounds a lot like a discussion section. So these questions are actually prompting you to do a lot of the figuring out what exactly needs to go in your research paper. But the idea is that you keep coming back to that mini summary so that everything is cohesive and you're not guessing, do I put this in the paper or not? Do I need to create a figure for this or not? It all needs to come back to that mini summary of your research story and how you're developing that story. So one important thing to think about is that, Stephen Hurd reminds us that when we think only the results necessary to support your conclusion are the ones that should be included in the paper. But that does not mean leaving out results that conflict with your conclusion, obviously. So I just wanted to point that out as you're figuring out what to include. If the results conflict, then that's something you need to consider as well. So as I pointed out, those questions look a lot like the order of discussion in a scientific research paper. And you can use them to build an outline then after you work through the questions. You can have a more substantial outline that is built around a central story, something that's cohesive again. Something that's important to remember about outlines are, one, an outline is a guide, but make sure that you are not just taking that as a rigid formula for writing your paper. Your story can change as you write it. So you need to go back to that mini summary and make sure you're making decisions based on the central question and answer that you're asking. I think I covered everything there. All right. Let's move on a little bit from that. So once you have this central question for your reader, one thing you want to figure out is how you're going to pitch that story. So again, you're not writing for yourself. You're not just keeping track of your research. You're writing for somebody else. And you may read timid pitches in the research you're reading, things like, I was interested in blank. Further studies are required to increase our understanding of blank, but these are really not kind of making use of the fact that you can get your reader much more interested in your research. If you say something like, no studies have reported on experiment or observation X, it's still not telling your readers why they should care, what makes your research compelling. So you want to keep in mind what matters is your central question's importance to your reader. not to you. So here are just some examples of ways that you can sell your story. And these don't need to necessarily make it into your paper explicitly, but you should have them in your mind. And then you should convey that idea implicitly in your paper somehow. So here are explicit statements, again, that you might want to write down and figure out what your kind of the way you're selling your story is, even if it doesn't make it into your paper just like this. So you might think about your question as there's a controversy in literature over this particular thing, and I present the kind of data needed to resolve. The fact that we don't know X hinders our efforts to understand Y, which is central to this, developing subdiscipline. Our lack of understanding of this thing X impedes our efforts to solve this other, economic or social or scientific or whatever problem Y. Or we need to know this more about this thing X because it's a model system widely used to investigate problems in field Y. Or I have discovered this thing X, which suggests a way to make progress towards this other difficult to reach thing Y. So these are just some examples of ways that you can really think about what your central question means to readers, not just to yourself. So I'll give you just a few minutes to kind of think about what you might do with your central question to make sure that it's compelling for readers. All right. So as I said, we don't have time to get into all the details of your paper, but one area that we will look at, and this is kind of just practice for what you can do in other parts of your paper, is the beginning of the introduction. How do you begin the paper at the very beginning? So one question you might have is, how broad should the opening be? And this, I'll show you just how all these decisions that you're making about your paper can relate back to your research story, that central question and answer. So looking at this opening to a paper published in Ecology, it starts out, since the late 1800s, nitrogen mineralization has been the perceived center point of the soil nitrogen cycle and the process that controls nitrogen availability to plants. So this sounds like a very broad opening for a paper. What would somebody expect this paper to be about? Well, we know it's about nitrogen mineralization, and which is going to be the center point for soil nitrogen cycle. But what's going to be the approach here? We need to look at the keywords that are being used. One keyword that you may have noticed is perceived, and that's a distinctive and unusual word that kind of draws in your attention. So clearly, even though we've just read the opening sentence, this paper is going to challenge that perception, the perception that the nitrogen mineralization has been the center point of the soil nitrogen cycle. So You're going to want to think about that opening sentence as, even if you're not stating something explicitly, how are you setting up the broader conversation? Pay attention to the words you're using and what you're suggesting. Another thing that you can notice about this opening is that we have a historical element. Since the late 1800s. That's not a random choice. That's a curated decision by the authors, that tells us that there's going to be a historical element in the paper. They are evaluating how the perception has changed since the late 1800s. So these are all signals for what's in the paper to come, and they're not random choices. So let's look at another opening. Current public health guidelines in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and Australia recommend that women consume a supplemental dose of 400 micrograms of folic acid per day in the month preceding and during the first trimester of pregnancy to reduce the risk of neural tube defects in children. So what is this paper going to be about? What is, or a key thing that we want to, maybe not what is it going to be about, what is the paper going to challenge? Can you imagine this paper not challenging the 400 microgram per day recommendation for folic acid? So this sentence isn't giving the grounds for challenging it, but we can infer that that's what's going to happen in the paper here. We'll look at one more example. In this one, I have the first sentence of the introduction and then the last sentence of the introduction, so we can see how they work together. So in the first sentence from this paper, we have conjugated polymers are novel materials that combine the optoelectric properties of semiconductors with the mechanical properties and processing advantages of plastics. So this paper is talking about, exciting new materials for developing plastic optoelectronic materials. The first sentence is, a bit abstract. We don't know exactly where it's going. We have a general idea. If you look at the last sentence of the introduction, we can see how it's in conversation with this first sentence, but giving us much more specifics. So thus, conjugated polymers offer the possibility for use in devices such as plastic LEDs, photovoltaics, transistors, and in completely new applications such as flexible displays. So you can see how, the introduction is cohesive because we start very broad, we narrow into specifics, much more concrete terms, real applications, and then we can infer the rest of the paper is going to be about how to perfect the polymers so that they can be used to produce the devices that are mentioned here. All right. So hopefully this gave you a good idea about some of the choices you're making in writing your paper and how language is so crucial in conveying ideas, even down to particular word choices. So, we're going to talk a little bit broadly about flow, but a little bit here about sentence structure. You can see this visualization of how a paper works. And we have all these arcs that show the connections between sections, between paragraphs, between sentences. And the problem here, the potential problem is if you aren't linking those arcs that should be in your paper. So if you've heard that you have a problem with flow in your paper, or you just feel like your paper doesn't have good flow, then what you really want to be looking for is places where you pick up a topic and then you jump to another topic and then you come back to that other topic somewhere else, and you're scattered, your discussion is scattered. So one way to think about how papers have good flow is to look at the sentence structure within your paragraphs. So, sentences are structured with a subject, verb, and object kind of the sentence. But we're going to just kind of change the wording up a little bit and think about how the beginning of the sentence is the topic of the sentence. Around the verb is the action. That's what's happening. And the end of the sentence is really where the stress is placed in the sentence. So with that in mind, the topics should be short and clear. The main verb should follow pretty close to the topic, not too long after the topic. And the key message should be at the stress, the end of the sentence. Now, these are really good guidelines to understand why certain sentences are effective and help you to figure out if you feel like a sentence isn't working, or if you're feeling like the flow isn't working. This is going to help you to identify problems. What you don't want to do is go through, make sure every sentence is following these rules, because these aren't rigid. These are supposed to be guidelines for helping you figure out what usually works in sentence structure, or it also helps you figure out if there's a problem. These are key places to look to fix the problem. So that position at the beginning of the sentence, the topic, your readers are going to interpret that as the topic of the sentence. The topic should be the common knowledge or information you already introduced. You don't want to start a sentence with information that the reader doesn't understand. They're going to be confused. So that should be common knowledge or something you've already talked about. Then the end of the sentence, the stress of the sentence, that's where you want to put the key words. That's the power position of the sentence. Those words carry the greatest weight. If you have a multi-clause sentence, you'll have several different stresses, positions at the end of each clause. The end of the sentence is still that main power position, but even within clauses, the end of a clause is going to be more of a key power position than the beginning of a clause. So it works within smaller structures as well. So let's just take a look at how this works. If I have some keywords here, viruses, 1989, most abundant biological entities in the sea, just putting them into the sentence obviously doesn't create meaning. And if we combine them different ways, we end up really creating different messages. Here are 3 potential messages that we could create just from these keywords. The difference between the sentences and how you interpret them isn't the language, it's the structure of the sentence mainly. What information comes where in the sentence. So in the first sentence, we have viruses were not studied in the sea until 1989, yet are its most abundant biological entities. Viruses is in the old information position in this sentence. And then in the new information position, the stress position, we have the most abundant biological entities. So we know that we're going to go on and kind of expand our understanding of where viruses are important here. In sentences B and C, on the other hand, we have most biological, we have the biological entities in the C as the beginning of the sentence in the topic position. So we can expect the coming kind of sentences to be about something different. So in sentence B, we have, they were not studied until 1989. So we know something about the timeline is going to be important. In sentence C, we emphasize the surprising new information is that the most abundant entities in the sea are viruses. So that's going to alert us to what's coming up in the sentences ahead. Here's another example of a sentence that we can look at and understand how structure affects interpretation. If we have a sentence, net mineralization represents the nitrogen available to plants because it reflects the difference between microbial nitrogen release and uptake in soil. We're starting with the idea that your reader understands what net mineralization is. So this is a topic that's unfamiliar to many readers. You want to think if your readers know that what that means or not. Is this a specialized journal where where your readers might know what that means and you don't need to kind of introduce it in a way? Or if you think your readers might not know what net mineralization means, you could rewrite it. The amount of nitrogen available for plants is controlled by the balance between microbial nitrogen uptake and release in soil. We define this balance as net nitrogen mineralization. So the concept is moved to that stress position at the end of the sentence. Do you see how this is much easier for a reader to take in the information? If you start off with something they're unfamiliar with, there's no scaffold for them to build the information that they're reading. They're going to read through until they get something they're familiar with. They're not going to remember what they read that they weren't unfamiliar with, or that they were unfamiliar with. Now, you remember I mentioned that you want to keep your topic close to your action. Net mineralization represents, or topic, comes right before the action. In the second sentence, the amount of nitrogen available for plants is controlled. We have a longer gap between kind of the topic and the action here. This is still acceptable in this example, and this is one of those things where you need to figure out. You just need to look at what you're working with and figure out if the gap is too big. What's at the beginning of the sentence in the topic, the amount of nitrogen available for plants, still acts as a very small unit. We can comprehend that, and we don't need to kind of. There aren't a lot of moving parts. And then we have is controlled right after it. So this is still acceptable for the subject-verb connection. In this example, though, we have a disconnected subject and verb. The pooled effect sizes, both with and without adjustment for environmental risk factors, were larger than DNA-based, were larger for DNA-based than RNA-based viruses. So hopefully that you notice this sentence is a little cumbersome to take in. And the reason is because we have this topic started, the pooled effect sizes, and then we have this added in clause, both with and without adjustment for environmental risk factors. And then we have were larger. By the time you get to were larger, your reader is likely going to forget what you're talking about, what is the topic of the sentence. So in instances like this, you can often rewrite your sentence to make it just much easier to comprehend for your readers. The pooled effect sizes were larger for DNA-based than RNA-based viruses, regardless of whether environmental risk factors were adjusted for. So hopefully you can see here that this is much easier to process and your readers aren't going to stumble over what you're saying and have to really slow down and go back and reread the beginning of your sentence and figure it out. You really want to be thinking about ways that you're not going to slow your reader down. You're not going to have your reader stumble over what they're reading and have to reread. Here's another example of something you can watch out for as you're thinking about your reader and clarity. If we have a sentence like this, it has been predicted that the global average temperature will increase at a rate of 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. You might say, I pretty much understand that. But what is a bit confusing here is that we don't know, someone predicted what is stated and temperature will rise. We have two things going on here, but it's not clear kind of who is doing what. We can just rewrite this for clarity to look something like this. Global average temperature has been predicted to increase at a rate of 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. So if you have the beginning of a sentence starting with something vague, like it has been predicted, something in passive voice, or something that doesn't have a clear topic, think about how you can rewrite it so that your reader can, when they jump into the sentence, they have a clear idea of who's doing what. Right. Another thing you might run into here with a sentence structure is the problem of burying your topic somewhere deep in your sentence. So in this example, we have here, in this study, taking advantage of a well-annotated genome map and effective targeted mutagenesis techniques, we analyzed the role of BAC17 in pathogenesis by Candida albicans. So if your reader comes along and gets to a sentence like this, they have to read pretty far to get to the subject of the sentence, the topic of the sentence. The subject of the sentence is we did something, we analyzed. When they're reading and they read taking advantage of a well-annotated genome map and effective targeted mutagenesis techniques, we don't know what that is qualifying. So we don't have anything to kind of link that to. So we don't know what to do with it. We don't have a framework for it. So oftentimes your reader will read quickly over something like that they don't have a framework for. And then we analyze the role of BAC17 in pathogenesis. And then hopefully though, maybe they'll go back or remember what that beginning section was, but that's pretty important here. So we can rewrite this to not slow down your reader and write it something like this. We analyze the role of BAC17 in pathogenesis by Candida albicans by taking advantage of a well-annotated genome map and effective targeted mutagenesis techniques. So hopefully you see how this is a lot easier for your reader to process, less likely to have to stop and go back and reread your sentence to understand the point you're making. So we looked at a few shorter sentences. This can work with more complex sentences too. So we have a long sentence here we'll work through. The qualitative agreement between caribou's preference for feeding on young leaves and the trend for protein to decline with leaf age supports the hypothesis that caribou migration is driven by the patterns of leaf out and maturation spatially and temporally through their home range rather than by weather. So hopefully you see that's very long. And having long sentences, of course, you want to be watching for them, but they're not problematic in themselves. If they're well structured, you might have some long sentences. But the problem here is that this is not a well-structured sentence. It's ends up being very confusing. And a big part of that, again, is this: what is the topic here at the beginning of the sentence? So if we're looking for, the verb here, we have to go all the way down to supports. So we have this very long topic, and that is the qualitative agreement between caribou's preference for feeding on young leaves and the trend for protein to decline with leaf age. It's 21 words long, and it's way too complex. What the writer is doing is they're trying to be very careful and qualify what they're saying, trying to say it very precisely, but they end up lacking clarity for their reader by trying to be that precise. So we can simplify this, we can condense it to a much more simple kind of opening topic. The qualitative agreement, we could just say instead, caribou prefer to feed on young protein-rich leaves at the beginning of the sentence here. So what is going to be the stress of this sentence then? We need to put the stress at the end of the sentence. Right now, the stress is rather than by whether. But the stress of the sentence, the author's intended stress is that caribou follow food, right? The spatial and temporal patterns of leaf out maturation. So we need to put that at the end of the sentence. And if we do that, then we have a sentence that reads like this: caribou prefer to feed on young protein-rich leaves, supporting the hypothesis that migration is not driven by weather, but by spatial and temporal patterns of leaf out and maturation. So here we have a shorter topic, a verb that follows closely after the topic. We have the stress of the sentence in that key position at the end of the sentence. After that stress position, the topic is kind of the next most important part of the sentence. The middle part of the sentence is, of course, it's important, but that's not where your reader is going to focus. So hopefully you can see how the write is much easier to read for your reader. You have a question about the link. I know on the library website, the video will be available. The Zoom video will be available for everyone. I'm not sure how to find that. I believe it's on the page that you registered, but I'm sure we can get that information then. All right. So just summarizing the things that we went on. Summarizing the things that we went over here. Let's see if we have 6 minutes left. I think we can look at one more example here. So salvage logging is an increasingly common way of harvesting forests that have been attacked by insect pests. In salvage logging, trees that have been attacked are selectively harvested. Cavities in standing dead trees serve as nesting sites for birds. The population biology of cavity nesting birds is therefore likely affected by salvage logging. So let's take a look at how some of these rules work in a paragraph. And one thing I really want you to notice here is how we're actually breaking some of the rules. So in the third sentence here, we have, well, in the second sentence, we have in salvage logging, trees that have been attacked are selectively harvested. And then we seem to jump kind of to a different topic. Cavities in standing dead trees serve as nesting sites for the birds. Oh, sorry, I thought I had the rewrite here. There is a jump. It seems like there's a jump because there is a jump. And I wanted to show you the rewrite instead. If we rewrite it and have here that dead trees that are harvested, so then we have here the third sentence that you can see how we continue a topic that has been started earlier. It's not how the end of this sentence ends, but it's a topic that your reader will understand. So because it's being picked up from earlier the idea has been established earlier in the paragraph. So you can see how we're kind of breaking a rule, but also it's not disrupting the flow here. We have this, we have the idea being carried over here. Sorry about that. I thought I had some more details for that sentence. Anyway, we're about out of time. I don't want to start on anything new here. So I'm gonna wrap things up. Does anyone have any questions about anything? Just have a minute or two and then. So I'll go ahead and submit the Zoom video soon, and you should be able to access it on the library website. All right, I hope this has been helpful for everyone. I guess key thing to remember, I think, is think about that mini summary that you develop, the central question answer, and think about how all of your parts of your paper are working to develop that mini summary. It's really going to be the key to helping you figure out how to have a cohesive paper. And then once you have that cohesive structure, you can look at the sentence level and see how ideas are connected within the paper. So hopefully this gives you tools to do both some big picture, work on some big picture issues, and then work them out on the sentence level a bit too.